Claire, stop pretending you're useful, my father said loudly across the dinner table, loud enough for 12 relatives and 3 of his business partners to hear. Everyone in this family knows Madison is the one with potential. My name is Claire Whitmore, I'm 31 years old, and for 18 years my family called me exactly one thing, the useless one. They said it casually, like a nickname that stuck after a joke. They said it at holidays, at birthday dinners, at company parties where investors shook my father's hand and my sister Madison stood beside him like the future CEO of everything he'd built. I used to think if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, maybe one day they'd stop saying it. But 3 weeks ago something happened that changed everything. My phone buzzed during the most important night in my father's professional life, and the message on the screen showed a number so large I thought it had to be a mistake. A wire transfer had just landed in my account for $52 million. And the person who authorized it was someone my family hadn't mentioned in 12 years. Before I tell you how that happened, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if stories about proving people wrong resonate with you. I also love hearing where everyone is watching from, so drop a comment telling me your city and what time it is there right now. I read more of those comments than you might think. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because the truth is the $52 million transfer didn't start with money. It started with a label that followed me through most of my life. I grew up in a town outside Chicago where my last name meant something. Whitmore Logistics had warehouses across 3 states, a fleet of trucks on every interstate between Illinois and Ohio, and a reputation that made people stand a little straighter when my father walked into a room. Richard Whitmore liked to remind everyone that he built the company from nothing but discipline and good decisions. At least that's the story he told at charity dinners and business conferences. In our house, though, the story was a little different. In our house there were 2 categories of people, the investment and the liability. My older sister, Madison, was the investment. Madison had perfect grades, perfect hair, perfect timing when cameras appeared at family events. When she turned 16, my parents surprised her with a brand new Tesla Model 3, red ribbon across the hood, $48,000 worth of proof that the future of the Whitmore name was secure. That same year I got a refurbished laptop that cost $420 because, as my mother explained gently, Claire doesn't really need anything expensive for what she does. What I did, apparently, was exist quietly. At family dinners Madison talked about internships, networking events, and business competitions her professors recommended. I talked about data systems and how I liked mapping patterns in large information sets. My father would nod politely for about 10 seconds before changing the subject back to Madison's leadership potential. The first time I heard the phrase "the useless one" I was 13 years old. My parents were hosting a summer barbecue for clients and neighbors. Madison had just won a statewide academic award, and my father raised his glass to toast her future. Then someone asked what I wanted to be when I grew up. I remember saying something about computers and data modeling, words that didn't mean much to anyone standing around the patio. My father laughed lightly and said, "Claire is still figuring things out. Madison's the one with the real potential. Claire, well, she's our useless one." Everyone chuckled the way people do when they assume a father is making a harmless joke. I laughed too, because at 13 you laugh when adults expect you to. But that sentence stuck around long after the barbecue ended. It showed up at Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, and once during Madison's college send-off party when my father introduced her to an investor and said, "This is Madison, the future of Whitmore Logistics, and this is Claire, our resident useless one." By then I was 20 years old and already used to hearing it. The thing about labels is that people start believing them if they hear them long enough. Teachers expected less from me because my sister had already set the standard for excellence. Relatives stopped asking about my plans. Even my mother adopted a softer version of the same idea. She didn't call me useless, but she often said, "Claire just isn't wired the way Madison is." For a long time I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I really was the extra piece in a family puzzle that didn't need me. But there was one person who never used that word, not once in 18 years. My grandfather, Arthur Whitmore, the man whose name appeared on the original incorporation papers for Whitmore Logistics long before my father started telling the story his way. When everyone else laughed at my quiet nature, Grandpa Arthur would lean back in his chair, watch me carefully, and say something that confused me at the time but makes perfect sense now. He'd say, "Claire isn't slow. Claire is watching." At 13 I didn't understand what he meant. At 31, I finally do. Because the night that $52 million appeared in my bank account, the night my father stood on a stage celebrating 40 years of Whitmore Logistics while 200 guests applauded his leadership, I realized something my grandfather must have known all along. Being underestimated can be a disadvantage. But sometimes, if you're patient enough, it can also become the most powerful position in the room. For most of my childhood the rules inside the Whitmore house were never spoken out loud, but they were measured constantly in dollars, time, and attention. If you wanted to understand where you stood in the family hierarchy, you did not need a conversation. You only needed to look at the receipts. When Madison turned 16, the driveway filled with neighbors and relatives because my parents wanted witnesses for the moment. A delivery truck arrived with a red Tesla Model 3, brand new, $48,000, polished so brightly that the July sun reflected off the hood like a spotlight. My father handed Madison the key card in front of everyone and said this was what smart investments looked like. He liked using business language even at family events. Investment. Return. Potential. I stood beside the garage door holding a paper plate with barbecue on it while relatives clapped and took pictures. 2 weeks later my parents helped Madison open a brokerage account with $25,000 as what my father called a Head Start fund. He explained it during dinner one night as if he were presenting to a board of directors. Capital placed early grows faster. My mother nodded and said Madison deserved every advantage. The same year I asked if I could enroll in a summer coding program at the Community Technology Center 20 minutes away. Tuition was $1,200 for the entire summer. My father looked up from his laptop and asked a question that sounded reasonable on the surface but landed like a quiet verdict. "Claire, do you really think that program will lead anywhere meaningful?" My mother added that it might be better for me to focus on something simpler. The conversation ended there. The coding program never happened. When Madison graduated high school, the celebration filled a ballroom at the Lakeview Country Club. My parents rented the room for $12,000, hired a catering company from downtown Chicago, and printed programs that described Madison as the future of Whitmore Logistics. I know the exact cost because my father bragged about negotiating the contract down from $15,000. 2 weeks after that party I graduated from the same high school with a slightly higher grade point average than Madison had finished with 4 years earlier. My celebration was dinner at a casual Italian restaurant on Route 34. The total bill for 6 people was $118 including tax and tip. No speeches. No printed programs. Just pasta, polite congratulations, and my father checking his phone for emails from the warehouse managers. When college acceptance letters arrived, the contrast became even clearer. Madison chose the University of Southern California, a private school with tuition that cost $78,000 per year before housing. My father announced at dinner that supporting Madison through college would be the best long-term investment the family could make. He liked repeating that word investment as if the rest of us were part of a financial model. My own acceptance letter came from a state university 2 hours away with annual tuition of $11,000. I had qualified for a partial academic scholarship that covered half of it. I remember sliding the letter across the table toward my parents, hoping they might show the same excitement they showed Madison 4 years earlier. My father scanned the page and said that was a practical option. My mother asked whether the campus had a good bus system because she knew I would not have a car. Madison drove back from Los Angeles during her sophomore year in a new white BMW. That cost $62,000. She parked it in the driveway and spent most of the holiday explaining the networking opportunities she had through her business fraternity. My transportation that year was a used bicycle I bought online for $90. It carried me between classes, a part-time job at the campus computer lab, and a small apartment I shared with 2 roommates who worked night shifts at a grocery distribution center. I did not complain about any of it because complaining would have confirmed the label that followed me everywhere. Instead, I started paying attention to things most people overlooked. While Madison described leadership conferences and alumni mixers, I studied how systems moved information from one place to another. Databases, shipping networks, logistics software. I discovered that if you mapped enough pieces together you could see patterns others missed completely. During my sophomore year I built a small model that tracked delivery delays across 3 regional trucking companies. It was not glamorous, but the professor supervising the project told me something that stayed with me for years. Claire, the world runs on invisible systems. People who understand those systems quietly hold more power than anyone realizes. I did not tell my family about that conversation. At home the expectations were already set. Madison was the future executive whose tuition alone cost more than $200,000. I was the quiet daughter whose total college expenses never reached $30,000. The numbers spoke for themselves. Investment on one side of the ledger. Liability on the other. At least that was how my parents understood it. What they did not realize was that every time they compared the numbers out loud, every time my father joked to friends that Claire was simply not built for leadership, someone else in the room was listening much more carefully than anyone expected. The person who noticed those patterns before anyone else in my family did was my grandfather Arthur Whitmore. Most people in our town knew him as the quiet older man who rarely spoke during company events and never appeared in the press photos my father loved so much. But if you looked closely at the history of Whitmore Logistics, you would find something interesting. The original incorporation papers from 1983 listed Arthur Whitmore as the founder and majority owner. My father Richard Whitmore did not officially take over operational control until almost 15 years later. That detail was rarely mentioned during speeches or interviews. My father preferred the version of the story where he built the company from scratch with determination and smart decisions. My grandfather never corrected him in public. He simply watched. When I was a child, he spent most Sunday afternoons sitting in a leather chair in the corner of our living room while the rest of the family talked about business expansions and Madison's achievements. Every once in a while he would ask me a question that sounded small but forced me to think in ways nobody else expected. When I was 14, he asked me how many delivery routes Whitmore Logistics operated between Illinois and Indiana. I told him I had no idea. He smiled slightly and said the number was not important. What mattered was how those routes connected. He asked me to imagine each warehouse as a node in a larger system and every truck route as a line connecting those nodes. Then he said something that stayed with me for years. Claire, most people look at a business and see money. I look at a business and see movement. If you understand the movement, you understand everything. After that conversation he started bringing small things to show me when I visited him. Old shipping contracts. Maps of freight routes from the 1990s. Spreadsheets printed on paper that listed distribution schedules across several states. At first I assumed he was just sharing memories about the company he helped create. But over time I realized he was teaching me how to see what other people ignored. My father believed leadership came from charisma, aggressive deals, and impressive presentations during investor meetings. My grandfather believed leadership came from understanding systems that nobody else bothered to study. During my sophomore year of college, I spent an entire weekend at his house reviewing a stack of old logistics reports he had saved from earlier decades. He asked me to track how delivery times changed when one warehouse closed temporarily for maintenance. At first it looked like a simple delay in one location. But when I mapped the routes across 3 states, I saw something unexpected. The temporary closure forced trucks to reroute through 2 smaller distribution centers that normally handled much lower traffic. Within 72 hours, the entire regional network slowed down by nearly 15%. My grandfather leaned back in his chair when I explained it and gave a slow nod. "Exactly," he said. "One small shift in the right place changes the entire system. That is what people miss when they focus only on titles and appearances." Those afternoons became our quiet routine whenever I returned home from school. While Madison attended networking events in Los Angeles and posted photos from rooftop parties with classmates, I sat at my grandfather's kitchen table learning how companies actually worked beneath the surface. He never called it training. He said we were simply talking. But every conversation pushed me to think deeper about patterns, structures, and hidden connections inside large organizations. One evening near the end of my junior year, he asked me a question that felt strangely personal. "Claire, when your father jokes about you being useless, does it bother you?" I hesitated before answering because the honest answer was complicated. Of course it bothered me, but by that point I had heard the phrase so many times that it felt almost normal. I told him I had learned not to take it seriously. He watched me for a moment and then shook his head slowly. "Words like that shape how people see the world," he said. "But sometimes being underestimated gives you an advantage no one else has. When people believe you are not important, they stop watching what you are capable of doing." A few weeks after that conversation, he handed me something unexpected before I left to return to campus. It was a small black USB drive, nothing fancy, the kind you could buy for $15 at an office supply store. I remember laughing because it seemed like such an ordinary object after the serious tone of our conversation. "What is on this?" I asked. My grandfather closed his hand gently over mine before I could plug it into my laptop. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Keep it safe. One day you might need it, but you will know when the time is right." I slipped the USB drive into the inner pocket of my backpack and forgot about it for a long time. Life moved forward the way it always had in the Whitmore family. Madison finished her degree with impressive connections and returned home talking about future leadership roles inside the company. My father continued introducing her to business partners as the natural successor to Whitmore Logistics. And I accepted a modest position as a data systems analyst at a small logistics software firm outside Chicago. From the outside it probably looked like the family hierarchy had settled exactly the way everyone expected. Madison moving toward the executive suite. Claire working quietly in the background. But every once in a while I would remember the USB drive tucked inside my desk drawer and the calm certainty in my grandfather's voice when he said those words. "You will know when the time is right." At the time I had no idea how right he was, or how soon that moment would arrive. Life inside the Whitmore family followed a predictable rhythm for several years after I graduated from college. Madison moved back to Illinois with a resume that included internships, networking conferences, and a degree that my father loved mentioning during business dinners. Within 3 months she had an office inside the headquarters building of Whitmore Logistics with a glass door that had her name printed in silver letters. Director of Strategic Development. My father explained to anyone who asked that she was being prepared for eventual leadership. The salary attached to that title was $190,000 a year plus bonuses. I know the number because my mother mentioned it proudly at Thanksgiving while passing the cranberry sauce. During that same month I started my own job 30 minutes away in a modest brick office park that housed a logistics software company called Meridian Systems. My role was Data Systems Analyst Level 1. My starting salary was $58,000 per year with health insurance and a small retirement contribution if I stayed long enough to qualify. The office furniture was older, the coffee machine broke at least once every 2 weeks, and nobody in the building cared what your last name was as long as your work functioned correctly. For the first time in my life that felt strangely peaceful. My job involved reviewing large data sets from freight companies that used Meridian's software to manage shipping schedules. Thousands of deliveries moved through those systems every day. Each shipment created lines of information that tracked when a truck departed a warehouse, when it crossed state lines, when it arrived at the next distribution point. Most analysts simply reviewed those numbers to confirm that shipments stayed within the expected time windows. But I remembered the lessons my grandfather taught me about movement and connections. Instead of looking at individual shipments, I started mapping entire route networks the way he once showed me on paper maps spread across his kitchen table. Within a few months I began noticing patterns that were not immediately obvious. Certain distribution centers consistently slowed down deliveries on specific days of the week. Certain routes between Missouri and Illinois created cascading delays that spread through neighboring states like ripples in water. When I presented one of those findings during a routine internal meeting, my manager paused halfway through reviewing the chart and asked how long I had been working in logistics analysis. I told him less than a year. He stared at the screen again and said quietly that some analysts spend a decade before learning to read systems that way. Meanwhile, life inside my family continued following the familiar script. My father hosted quarterly dinners for business partners at expensive restaurants downtown where Madison sat beside him discussing expansion strategies and new warehouse acquisitions. I attended a few of those dinners out of politeness, sitting near the far end of the table while investors asked Madison about her vision for the company's future. Whenever someone asked what I did, my father would wave a hand dismissively and say Claire works with computers somewhere. It is not really her thing. The phrase usually triggered polite laughter from the people around the table. I learned to smile politely and return to whatever meal sat in front of me. But there was one evening that changed the atmosphere in a way I did not fully understand at the time. It happened during Madison's 25th birthday celebration at a private event room inside the Lakeview Country Club, the same place where her high school graduation party had taken place years earlier. Nearly 140 guests attended that night, including several executives from companies that partnered with Whitmore Logistics. My father stood near the front of the room with a glass of champagne while a projection screen displayed photos from Madison's childhood and college years. He loved creating moments that felt like corporate presentations even during family celebrations. Halfway through the evening he tapped a fork against his glass and asked everyone for their attention. Madison stood beside him smiling as he began describing her achievements in front of the entire room. He talked about her degree, her leadership skills, and the strategic insight she would bring to the company in the coming years. Then he paused and gestured toward me sitting at a table near the back of the room. Claire is here too, of course, he said with a light laugh. She helps out when she can. The room responded with the same polite laughter I had heard countless times before. I lowered my eyes toward the table and focused on the pattern in the white tablecloth because that was easier than meeting anyone's gaze. But when I glanced up a moment later I saw something different across the room. My grandfather Arthur was sitting quietly in a chair near the side wall watching the entire exchange. His expression did not change, but his eyes remained fixed on my father in a way that made the air feel slightly heavier. At the time I assumed he was simply tired of the usual family dynamics. What I did not realize was that he had already started putting something in motion months earlier, something connected to the small USB drive resting in the drawer of my apartment desk. The celebration ended late that night with music and more champagne while guests congratulated Madison on her promising future. I drove home afterward thinking about nothing more than the long week of work waiting for me on Monday morning. I had no idea that my grandfather had just witnessed the final confirmation he needed, or that the quiet game he started years earlier was about to enter its next phase. 3 weeks after Madison's birthday party, my grandfather called me on a quiet Tuesday evening while I was finishing a report at my apartment kitchen table. His voice sounded the same as always, calm and steady, but there was a seriousness in his tone that made me close my laptop immediately. He asked if I could drive over to his house the next afternoon after work because he wanted to show me something important. My grandfather did not usually ask for help with anything, so the request stayed in my mind for the rest of the day. The following afternoon I left the Meridian Systems office around 5:30 and drove the familiar 20-minute route to the small brick house where he had lived for more than 30 years. The sun was already setting when I pulled into the driveway. Inside the house the air smelled faintly of old books and coffee, the same way it had during every visit since I was a child. My grandfather was sitting at the kitchen table with several folders spread neatly in front of him. He looked older than I remembered, thinner somehow, but his eyes were as sharp as ever when he motioned for me to sit down. "Claire," he said quietly, "I want you to listen carefully because what we talk about today is not something you will share with anyone until the time is right." I nodded without speaking. Over the years I had learned that when my grandfather chose his words carefully it meant he was about to explain something that mattered. He slid one of the folders across the table toward me. Inside were legal documents printed on thick paper, the kind used for contracts and official filings. At the top of the first page I saw the words Whitmore Family Trust written in formal lettering. I looked up at him, confused, because my father had always claimed the company structure was straightforward. Whitmore Logistics operated as a private corporation controlled by the Whitmore family. My grandfather gave a faint smile when he saw my reaction. "Your father believes that story," he said. "Most people do. But the truth about ownership is a little more complicated." He explained that when Whitmore Logistics was first incorporated decades earlier he created a trust structure designed to protect the company from outside control if something ever went wrong with management. The trust held a significant percentage of the company's shares, but the details were not public because the documents were written in a way that only activated under specific conditions. I studied the pages in front of me and recognized several terms from the system diagrams he used to teach me years earlier. Control triggers. Ownership transfers. Conditional authority. The language looked complex at first, but the underlying structure followed the same pattern logic I had learned to map in shipping networks. Everything depended on when certain conditions were met. "Why are you showing this to me?" I asked finally. My grandfather leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together. "Because the person who understands a system best is the one who should be trusted to protect it," he replied. For a moment I thought he might be talking about Madison, since my father had spent years preparing her to lead the company. But my grandfather shook his head before I could say anything. "Your sister understands presentations and negotiations," he continued, "but leadership is not only about appearances. It is about understanding how every piece connects." Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a sealed brown envelope on the table between us. The paper felt heavier than a normal letter when I picked it up. "Inside that envelope are additional instructions connected to the trust structure," he said. "If certain conditions occur, the trust will transfer a large portion of its holdings to a designated beneficiary." My first assumption was that Madison must be the beneficiary. That would have matched everything my family believed about the future of Whitmore Logistics. But when I opened the envelope and scanned the first page, the name printed in the center stopped my breath for a moment. The beneficiary listed on the document was Claire Whitmore. I looked up again, convinced I had misunderstood something. My grandfather watched my reaction without speaking for several seconds. "You see the system clearly," he said eventually. "That is something no one else in this family has ever taken the time to learn." I tried to process what I was reading. According to the document, the trust would remain inactive unless a specific series of events proved that the company leadership no longer recognized the people who actually understood its internal structure. Only then would the assets shift to the beneficiary named in the document. "Why me?" I asked quietly. My grandfather gave a small tired laugh. "Because you have spent your entire life observing instead of performing," he answered. "And because the person everyone overlooks is often the only one paying attention when it matters most." He placed his hand gently on the envelope and pushed it back toward me. "Keep this safe, Claire. Do not open the final file inside until the moment arrives. When that moment comes, you will know exactly what to do." I left his house that evening carrying the envelope in my bag with a strange mixture of confusion and responsibility settling over my thoughts. At the time, I still believed the conditions described in those documents might never actually happen. I had no idea how quickly my grandfather's quiet plan was moving toward the moment he had prepared for. For several months after that evening at my grandfather's house, life appeared to continue exactly the same way it always had in the Whitmore family. I placed the envelope he gave me inside the locked drawer of my apartment desk along with the small USB drive he had handed me years earlier. At first I told myself the documents might simply be a precaution he created long ago and never expected to use. The trust language was complex, full of legal phrasing that required specific triggers before anything would actually change. As far as I could see, none of those conditions had happened yet. Meanwhile, my daily routine remained steady. Each morning I drove to the Meridian Systems office and spent the day analyzing shipping data from freight companies that used our logistics platform. Over time, my manager began assigning me more complex projects because the pattern models I built consistently predicted network slowdowns before they occurred. Within 18 months, my salary increased to $72,000 and I moved into a slightly larger apartment closer to downtown Chicago. My life was quiet but stable, and for the first time I felt comfortable building something on my own without needing approval from anyone in my family. Inside the Whitmore Logistics headquarters building, however, the atmosphere was changing. Madison's role inside the company continued expanding quickly. By the time she turned 28, she had been promoted twice and now held the title Vice President of Strategic Development. Her annual compensation package had climbed to $240,000 plus stock options that my father described as an investment in the future leadership of the company. At family dinners, he spoke proudly about the next stage of Whitmore Logistics growth, explaining that Madison was helping prepare the company for something much larger than a regional freight operation. One evening he finally revealed what that meant. The company was preparing for a public offering within the next 2 years. An initial public offering would allow Whitmore Logistics to sell shares on the stock market and raise significant capital for expansion across the entire Midwest. My father described it as the natural evolution of a successful company. Investors had already shown interest. Financial advisors were evaluating the timing. Madison would play a central role in presenting the company's future to potential shareholders. Everyone around the dinner table listened with admiration while my father explained the opportunity in detail. A successful offering could value the company at hundreds of millions of dollars. I congratulated Madison politely when the conversation paused, but inside my thoughts moved in a different direction. The moment my father mentioned the upcoming public offering, something from the trust documents in my desk drawer resurfaced in my memory. Several pages inside those documents described how the Whitmore family trust would respond if the company attempted a structural transformation without recognizing the original ownership protections written decades earlier. I had not thought about that clause in months, but now the wording returned to me almost exactly as I had read it that evening in my grandfather's kitchen. If a public restructuring occurs while the original trust authority is ignored or bypassed, the trust shall activate an automatic reassignment of holdings according to the designated beneficiary instructions. At the time I had assumed those lines were theoretical, part of a legal safeguard that might never be relevant. But the more my father talked about preparing Whitmore Logistics for the stock market, the more I wondered whether he fully understood how the original company structure had been designed. The following weekend I visited my grandfather again and told him what my father had announced. He listened quietly while I described the public offering plan. When I finished he nodded slowly as if confirming something he had already expected. Companies change when new generations take control, he said calmly. Sometimes those changes reveal whether people truly understand the systems they inherited. I asked him directly whether the trust clause might be triggered by the kind of restructuring my father described. My grandfather gave a small thoughtful smile instead of answering immediately. "Claire, the purpose of a system is not to punish people," he explained. "The purpose is to protect the integrity of what was built. If someone ignores the foundation of that system, the consequences simply follow the rules that were written long before." His words stayed with me during the drive back to my apartment that evening. Over the next several weeks, news about the potential public offering continued spreading through business circles in Chicago. Local financial publications began mentioning Whitmore Logistics as a company preparing for major expansion. Madison appeared in a short interview discussing innovation in regional freight networks. My father attended multiple meetings with investment advisors and corporate lawyers. From the outside it looked like the Whitmore family was entering the most successful chapter in the company's history. Yet every time I heard someone mention the upcoming offering, I felt the quiet weight of the sealed envelope waiting in my desk drawer. I still had not opened the final file inside because my grandfather's instructions were clear. Do not open the last document until the moment arrives. At the time I did not know exactly what that moment would look like. But I could feel something shifting beneath the surface of events, the same way a small change in a shipping route can ripple through an entire logistics network before anyone notices the delay. Somewhere inside the system my grandfather built decades earlier, a set of conditions was slowly moving toward activation. And when those conditions were finally met, the quiet assumptions my family had repeated for 18 years were about to collide with a reality none of them had prepared for. The months leading up to the proposed public offering moved quickly, but for me time felt strangely stretched between two different realities. On one side was the version of the story my family believed, where Whitmore Logistics was preparing to become a publicly traded company under my father's leadership and Madison's strategic guidance. On the other side was the quiet set of documents resting inside my desk drawer, waiting for a moment that might never come, or might arrive sooner than anyone expected. I continued working at Meridian Systems, but the more experience I gained analyzing logistics networks, the harder it became to ignore the structural details my grandfather had shown me inside those trust documents. Every system has pressure points. In freight networks, those pressure points appear when a warehouse closes or a route shifts unexpectedly. In corporate structures, the pressure points appear when ownership rules conflict with new decisions made by leadership. As Whitmore Logistics moved closer to its public offering, those pressure points started appearing more clearly than ever. One evening my father invited the family to dinner at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Chicago to celebrate what he called a milestone moment. When I arrived, Madison was already seated beside him with several folders spread across the table. The conversation quickly turned into what felt more like a board meeting than a family dinner. My father explained that the company's financial advisors had finalized the preliminary structure for the public offering. Investment banks were preparing the filings that would eventually be submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission. If everything went according to schedule, Whitmore Logistics could go public within 18 months. The projected valuation mentioned during that dinner was more than $300 million. My father described the number with visible pride. Madison added details about expansion into new distribution centers across the Midwest, explaining how the public offering would provide capital to triple the company's shipping capacity within 5 years. Everyone around the table listened with admiration while they spoke. At one point my father turned toward me and asked what I thought about the plan. It was a rare moment when he actually invited my opinion about anything related to the company. I chose my words carefully. "The strategy sounds ambitious," I said. "But restructuring ownership during a public offering can be complicated if the original corporate protections are still active." My father looked at me with mild confusion before smiling politely. "Claire, we have corporate attorneys handling all of that," he replied. Madison added that their legal team had already reviewed the company's structure thoroughly. Everything was perfectly clear. I nodded and returned to my meal without saying anything else. But inside my thoughts moved in a different direction. I had read the trust documents carefully enough to know the structure was not as simple as my father believed. Several provisions inside those papers were written specifically to activate if a public restructuring occurred without recognition of the trust authority created by my grandfather decades earlier. According to the wording I remembered, the moment the company formally filed for its public offering without addressing those provisions, the trust would automatically initiate its contingency plan. That realization followed me home that night like a quiet echo. After midnight I unlocked the drawer of my desk and took out the sealed envelope again. For several minutes I simply stared at it, remembering my grandfather's instruction not to open the final file until the right moment arrived. The question that kept returning to my mind was whether that moment was approaching faster than anyone realized. If the trust activated exactly the way the documents described, the consequences would reach far beyond a simple transfer of assets. My father's entire plan for the company could change overnight. The responsibility of triggering that chain of events rested with me, the one person my family had spent years dismissing as irrelevant. For the first time since my grandfather gave me the envelope, I felt the full weight of the decision ahead. If I ignored the trust instructions, nothing would happen. Whitmore Logistics would proceed with its public offering, Madison would likely become the face of the company's new leadership, and my role in the story would remain exactly what my father had always described. But if I followed the instructions inside the envelope at the right moment, the entire ownership structure of the company could shift in a way no one in my family had anticipated. I sat there in silence for a long time with the envelope resting on the desk in front of me. The city lights outside my apartment window reflected faintly against the glass while the clock on my kitchen wall moved slowly toward 1 a.m. Eventually I placed the envelope back inside the drawer and locked it again. The time had not come yet. But the system my grandfather designed was clearly moving closer to the moment when every piece would finally connect. And when that moment arrived, the quiet assumptions my family had repeated for 18 years would face a reality none of them had ever considered possible. 2 weeks after that long night staring at the envelope in my desk drawer, the system finally moved one step closer to the moment my grandfather had predicted. The change did not begin inside a courtroom or a boardroom. It began with a simple email notification that appeared on my phone while I was reviewing shipment data at the Meridian Systems office. The message came from a financial news alert service I subscribed to for industry updates. The headline read that Whitmore Logistics had officially hired an investment bank to begin preparing the documentation required for a future public offering. According to the article, the company planned to file its preliminary registration statement with federal regulators within the next several months. When I read that sentence, my attention shifted immediately to the timing described inside the trust documents. The clause I remembered was very precise. The trust would remain inactive until the company formally initiated the restructuring process required for public ownership. Once that filing occurred, a 72-hour evaluation window would begin. If the company leadership failed to acknowledge the trust authority during that window, the contingency structure would activate automatically. I closed the news article and sat quietly for several seconds while the meaning of that timeline settled into my thoughts. For years my father had treated the company structure as if it belonged entirely to the current leadership team. But my grandfather had built something deeper beneath the surface, a protective framework designed to preserve the original foundation of Whitmore Logistics even if future decisions ignored it. Later that evening I drove to my grandfather's house again, the same short route I had taken many times before. The sky was already dark when I arrived, and the front porch light cast a warm circle across the driveway. Inside the house he was sitting in the same kitchen chair where he had shown me the trust documents months earlier. When I mentioned the news about the investment bank he nodded slowly as if confirming information he already knew. "The system is moving forward," he said quietly. "That means the window you read about will open soon." I asked him directly whether he believed my father understood the existence of the trust clause. My grandfather's expression softened slightly. "Your father understands many things about running a company," he replied. "But he has always believed the visible structure tells the whole story. Some foundations are invisible unless someone takes the time to study them carefully." He then asked whether I had opened the final file inside the envelope. I told him I had not because his instructions were clear. He gave a small approving nod and said the time to read that file would arrive very soon. "When the company files its official registration documents, you will have exactly 3 days to decide whether the trust activates according to the plan that was written years ago." 3 days sounded like a long time at first, but as he explained the sequence of events it became clear that the decision window would pass quickly once the filing occurred. During those 72 hours the beneficiary named in the trust would have the authority to confirm the activation instructions. If no action occurred, the restructuring would proceed without interference and the trust would remain dormant indefinitely. In other words, the entire outcome depended on whether I chose to act during that brief moment when the system opened. I drove back to my apartment that night with a strange mixture of calm and uncertainty. For most of my life I had been the person standing quietly at the edge of family events while everyone else made decisions about the company's future. Now the most significant structural decision in the history of Whitmore Logistics might depend on whether I followed instructions written long before anyone imagined the current situation. The following days passed with unusual focus. At Meridian Systems I continued working through complex logistics models, but part of my attention remained fixed on the unfolding developments surrounding my family's company. Financial media began mentioning Whitmore Logistics more frequently as analysts speculated about the potential scale of the upcoming offering. Madison appeared in another short interview describing how the company planned to modernize freight tracking technology across the Midwest. Watching the interview on my laptop one evening felt strangely surreal because I knew something about the company's internal structure that the entire financial community had overlooked. Eventually the moment my grandfather described arrived. One Thursday afternoon another alert appeared on my phone announcing that Whitmore Logistics had officially submitted its preliminary registration statement to federal regulators. The article included a brief summary of the filing and a projected valuation estimate based on current revenue figures. As I read the details, a single line from the trust documents returned to my mind with perfect clarity. Upon the formal filing of restructuring documents initiating a public offering, the evaluation period shall begin immediately and remain open for 72 hours. I looked at the clock on my computer screen. The window had just opened. For the first time since my grandfather handed me the envelope, the system he created decades earlier was no longer theoretical. The quiet sequence of conditions had been met exactly as the documents described. Somewhere inside the legal structure of Whitmore Logistics a mechanism was waiting for confirmation from the one person my family had never considered important. I closed my laptop slowly and sat back in the chair, aware that the next 72 hours would determine whether the story my family had believed for 18 years would continue unchanged or transform in a way none of them were prepared to see. The moment I realized the 72-hour window had opened. The world around me continued moving exactly the same way it always had, but inside my mind everything felt different. I finished the remaining tasks at the Meridian Systems office that afternoon, answered 2 routine emails from my manager, and drove home through the same Chicago traffic I had navigated hundreds of times before. On the surface, nothing about the evening looked unusual. Yet every few minutes my thoughts returned to the single fact that mattered more than anything else. The system my grandfather created decades earlier was now active. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me, placed my bag on the kitchen counter, and walked directly to the desk in the corner of the living room. The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside were the 2 objects that had quietly followed me through the past several years of my life. The small USB drive my grandfather gave me long ago and the sealed brown envelope containing the trust instructions. For a moment I simply looked at them without touching anything. 18 years of hearing the same label repeated at family gatherings had conditioned me to believe my role in the Whitmore story was always going to remain on the edge of the frame. Yet the documents inside that envelope suggested something entirely different. Slowly I broke the seal and removed the final file my grandfather had told me not to read until the right moment arrived. The paper inside contained a detailed explanation of the contingency structure built into the Whitmore family trust. The language was formal and precise, but the logic behind it was clear once I traced the sequence step by step. When the company initiated a public offering without formally recognizing the trust authority, the trust would automatically initiate a conversion of its holdings into liquid assets tied to the company's valuation at the moment of restructuring. Those assets would then transfer directly to the beneficiary listed in the document. The number printed on the final page made me pause. Based on the company's projected valuation at the time of filing, the trust holdings represented a financial position worth approximately $52 million. For several seconds I simply stared at the figure, letting the scale of it settle into reality. My entire annual salary at Meridian Systems was $72,000. The number written on that page represented more money than I had ever imagined personally controlling. But the amount itself was not the most important detail. The most important detail was the final instruction printed beneath it. The beneficiary may confirm activation at any point during the 72-hour evaluation period following the restructuring filing. Confirmation may be executed through the attached authorization mechanism. I sat back in the chair and looked at the USB drive resting beside the document. That small piece of plastic and metal suddenly carried the weight of a decision that could reshape the future of Whitmore Logistics overnight. If I activated the trust according to the instructions, the system would execute exactly as my grandfather designed it. The holdings would convert, the funds would transfer, and the company structure would shift in ways my father and Madison had never anticipated. If I did nothing, the 72-hour window would close quietly and the entire trust mechanism would remain dormant forever. My father would proceed with his public offering plan, Madison would continue preparing to leave the company, and my life would remain largely unchanged. For the next several hours I read through the documents again and again, mapping the logic exactly the way I analyzed logistic systems at work. Each clause connected to the next in a clear sequence. There were no hidden traps or unexpected conditions. My grandfather had written the system with the same precision he used when designing freight networks decades earlier. Eventually I noticed something else included at the end of the instructions. A short handwritten note in my grandfather's careful script. Claire, the purpose of this structure was never revenge. It exists to ensure that the people who truly understand a system are the ones trusted to protect it. Read the situation carefully and choose the path that preserves integrity. I closed the folder slowly after reading those lines. The next morning the financial news cycle continued celebrating Whitmore Logistics as one of the region's most promising companies preparing for expansion. Madison appeared in another interview discussing how innovation and strong leadership were guiding the company into a new era. Watching the interview on my laptop felt strangely distant. The entire conversation about the company's future assumed that the foundation beneath it was simple and secure. Yet the real foundation had been waiting quietly for decades inside a legal structure. Nobody had bothered to study closely. By the second evening of the 72-hour window, I had reached a decision. Systems work best when every part of their design is respected. My grandfather built the Whitmore Trust to protect the integrity of the company's structure. If the current leadership had chosen to move forward without acknowledging that foundation, the system itself would provide the correction he intended. I connected the USB drive to my laptop and opened the authorization file stored inside. The screen displayed a simple confirmation interface linked to the trust documentation I had been studying for hours. My finger hovered above the trackpad for a moment before I completed the final step that activated the sequence my grandfather had designed long before anyone imagined this moment would arrive. The moment I completed the authorization step on my laptop, the screen did not explode with dramatic alerts or flashing warnings. In fact, the system responded with something surprisingly simple. A single confirmation message appeared stating that the Whitmore Family Trust Contingency Protocol had been successfully activated and that the asset conversion process would begin automatically according to the legal structure attached to the filing date of Whitmore Logistics. I sat there quietly staring at the message for several seconds while the weight of what I had just done slowly settled into reality. For years the narrative inside my family had been simple and predictable. My father led the company. Madison represented the future of the company. I was the extra piece people barely noticed during conversations about leadership and expansion. Yet the system my grandfather designed did not care about that narrative. It only cared about whether the conditions written in the trust documents had been met. And according to the confirmation message on my screen, those conditions had now been triggered exactly as he predicted. I closed the laptop and went to bed that night without telling anyone what had happened. The following morning began like any other weekday. I drove to the Meridian Systems office, greeted my co-workers, and opened the project dashboard that tracked freight delays across several regional carriers. But around 10:30 in the morning my phone vibrated on the desk beside my keyboard. The notification came from my banking application. At first I assumed it was the routine weekly deposit from my salary account or perhaps a billing reminder. When I unlocked the screen and opened the message, the numbers displayed in the notification were so large that for a moment my brain refused to process them as real. The alert read incoming wire transfer confirmed. I tapped the message and the full transaction details opened on the screen. The amount listed beside the transfer was $52 million. The sender field referenced the Whitmore Family Trust liquidation account, exactly the entity described in the documents my grandfather had shown me months earlier. For a long time I simply stared at the screen while the office around me continued buzzing with normal conversation and keyboard clicks. No one else in the room had any idea that one of the quiet analysts sitting at the end of the row had just received a transfer larger than the total annual revenue of some small companies. I locked the phone again and placed it face down on the desk, forcing myself to finish the work task scheduled for that morning before allowing the reality of the situation to fully settle in. Later that afternoon, financial news began circulating another update about Whitmore Logistics. Analysts praised the company's growth trajectory and described the recent regulatory filing as the first step toward a successful public offering. Watching the coverage felt surreal because none of those reports mentioned the quiet structural shift that had already taken place beneath the company's ownership framework. My grandfather's trust had converted its holdings exactly the way the documents described, releasing the assets tied to the original company structure. The money sitting in my account was not a gift or a random windfall. It was the result of a system executing the contingency my grandfather had built decades earlier. That evening my father called to invite the family to a celebration event scheduled for the following weekend. Whitmore Logistics was hosting a private gathering to mark the official beginning of its expansion campaign, and several business partners from across the Midwest would attend. My father sounded excited as he described the event. Investors were interested. The company's future looked brighter than ever. Madison would give a short presentation about the next phase of strategic growth. I agreed to attend without mentioning anything about the transfer that had appeared in my account earlier that day. There would be time for that conversation later. Over the next few days, the reality of the financial change began settling into my life in quiet ways. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor recommended by Meridian Systems to discuss how to manage the sudden increase in assets responsibly. I reviewed the trust documentation again to confirm that the transfer process had followed the exact legal framework my grandfather created. Every detail matched the sequence described in the files I had studied during those 72 hours. By the time the weekend arrived, the company celebration event had become the most anticipated gathering my family had hosted in years. The venue was a large hotel ballroom overlooking the Chicago River. More than 200 guests were expected, including investors, executives, and longtime partners who had worked with Whitmore Logistics for decades. When I arrived that evening, the room was already filled with conversation and soft music playing in the background. Madison stood near the stage greeting guests while my father moved confidently between small groups of investors discussing the company's future plans. To anyone watching from across the room, it looked like a perfect moment of success for the Whitmore family. But inside my purse, my phone carried the quiet proof that the system my grandfather designed had already changed the story in a way no one in that ballroom was prepared to understand. The ballroom overlooking the Chicago River glowed with warm light reflecting off tall glass windows and polished marble floors. Waiters moved quietly between tables carrying trays of champagne while soft jazz music played in the background. Nearly every face in the room belonged to someone connected to Whitmore Logistics in one way or another. Investors from Milwaukee. Distribution partners from Indiana. A few local journalists who had begun paying attention to the company's planned expansion. My father stood near the front of the room speaking confidently with a group of executives while Madison greeted guests beside a projection screen that displayed a sleek presentation titled The Next Era of Whitmore Logistics. I took a seat near the back of the ballroom and watched the event unfold with the calm detachment I had learned over many years of family gatherings. Nothing about the evening looked unusual. My father eventually stepped onto the small stage near the center of the room and tapped the microphone lightly to get everyone's attention. The conversations faded almost instantly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us. Tonight, he began with the same confident tone I had heard since childhood. Whitmore Logistics has spent 40 years building one of the most reliable freight networks in the Midwest. Tonight we celebrate the beginning of our next chapter. Applause spread across the room as he described the company's growth, the planned public offering, and the vision Madison had helped shape for the company's future. Madison joined him on stage halfway through the speech and began explaining the strategic expansion plan using charts projected onto the large screen behind them. Distribution hubs across 5 new states. Advanced freight tracking technology. A projected increase in annual revenue that would more than double within the next decade. The audience listened with admiration. Every part of the presentation reinforced the narrative my family had built for years. Richard Whitmore, the founder figure guiding the company forward. Madison Whitmore, the brilliant strategist ready to lead the next generation. I sat quietly near the back table listening to the speech while my phone rested inside my purse beside the documents my grandfather had created. When Madison finished her presentation, the audience applauded again and my father returned to the microphone for a final remark. He thanked the investors for believing in the company and praised the leadership team that would carry Whitmore Logistics into the future. At one point his eyes briefly scanned the room and landed on me near the back table. For a second he hesitated before adding a familiar phrase that several guests around him had probably heard before. "And of course my other daughter Claire is here tonight as well," he said with a small laugh that echoed lightly through the room. She has always been part of the family even if business strategy is not exactly her strength. A few people near the stage chuckled politely, the same quiet reaction I had heard many times before. Normally that moment would have passed without comment. I would have smiled politely and allowed the evening to continue exactly the way it always had. But tonight something was different. For the first time in my life the label attached to my name no longer matched the reality sitting quietly in my purse. I stood up slowly from the table and walked toward the front of the room while my father continued speaking. The movement caught the attention of several guests who turned their heads as I approached the stage. My father paused mid-sentence when he realized I was standing beside him near the microphone. "Claire, is something wrong?" he asked quietly, lowering the microphone slightly so the room could not hear him clearly. I shook my head gently and looked out across the audience before responding. "Nothing is wrong, Dad. I just realized something tonight." The room grew unusually quiet as I reached into my purse and removed my phone. A few seconds later the large screen behind the stage changed from Madison's presentation slides to the image I had just mirrored from my phone. The display showed the confirmation screen from my banking application with the transaction details clearly visible under the bright lights of the ballroom. Incoming wire transfer confirmed. Amount $52 million. Source Whitmore Family Trust liquidation account. A wave of confused murmurs moved through the audience as the meaning of the numbers slowly became clear. My father stared at the screen for several seconds without speaking. Madison looked between the display and my face as if trying to understand what she was seeing. I kept my voice calm when I finally spoke again. The system my grandfather built decades ago was designed to protect the company if its leadership ever forgot how the foundation worked, I said quietly. It turns out the system was still active. The silence that followed felt heavier than any reaction I had experienced in that room before. Investors exchanged uncertain glances while several executives leaned closer to read the details displayed on the screen. My father finally lowered the microphone and looked directly at me with an expression I had never seen from him before, a mixture of confusion and realization that something fundamental about the story he believed had just changed in front of everyone watching. For 18 years the narrative inside our family had been simple. Tonight that narrative had quietly shifted in a way no speech or presentation could explain. For several seconds after the screen behind me displayed the transfer confirmation, the ballroom remained almost completely silent. The quiet was not the polite pause that usually followed a speech or a presentation. It was the kind of silence that appears when people realize the story they thought they understood has suddenly shifted in front of them. My father slowly lowered the microphone while continuing to stare at the numbers on the projection screen. Madison stood beside him with her presentation remote still in her hand, the carefully prepared slides about expansion and leadership now frozen behind the image of a bank transfer none of them had expected to see. Around the room several investors leaned closer to one another, quietly asking questions that no one at the front of the stage could answer yet. I did not raise my voice or try to dominate the moment. Instead I spoke calmly, the same way my grandfather used to explain complex systems at his kitchen table. The trust structure created when Whitmore Logistics was incorporated was designed to protect the company if its leadership ever moved forward without acknowledging the foundation it was built on, I said. When the company filed its restructuring documents for the public offering, the trust automatically evaluated whether that foundation had been recognized. It had not. Therefore the contingency clause activated exactly as it was written decades ago. I turned slightly toward the screen where the transfer details remained visible to everyone in the room. The system converted the trust holdings into liquid assets tied to the company valuation at the moment of filing. Those assets were transferred to the beneficiary listed in the original documents. A quiet murmur moved through the audience again as the explanation settled into place. My father finally lifted the microphone again, but the confidence that normally filled his voice was gone. "Claire," he said slowly, what exactly are you saying happened here? I met his eyes for a moment before answering. I am saying the company structure you believed you controlled completely was actually built on a framework created by Grandpa Arthur long before any of us were standing in this room. That framework activated automatically when the conditions he predicted were met. Madison looked at the screen again and then back at me. You are saying the trust transferred $52 million to you because the company filed for a public offering, she said carefully, as if repeating the logic might somehow make it less surprising. I nodded slightly. Not because of the offering itself, I replied. Because the offering moved forward without recognizing the structure that protected the company's foundation. That distinction mattered to the system my grandfather designed. The room remained quiet for several seconds while the investors absorbed the explanation. Some of them had been in logistics long enough to understand that the strongest systems often operate silently until a specific condition forces them to reveal themselves. My father finally exhaled slowly and lowered the microphone again. For the first time in my life he looked at me not as the quiet daughter sitting at the edge of family events but as someone who had just demonstrated an understanding of the company's structure that he had never fully considered. I turned toward the audience one last time before stepping away from the microphone. I am not here tonight to embarrass anyone or rewrite the history of this company, I said calmly. Whitmore Logistics exists because my grandfather built a system strong enough to survive leadership mistakes. That system simply worked the way it was designed to work. With that I stepped away from the stage and returned to the back of the ballroom while the screen slowly faded back to Madison's presentation slides. The rest of the evening continued in a quieter tone than anyone had expected when the event began. Conversations shifted from confident predictions about the company's future to careful discussions about the legal structure that had just revealed itself. I left the event early and walked along the Chicago River for several minutes before calling a car to take me home. The city lights reflected across the water as the reality of everything that had happened finally settled in completely. The transfer sitting in my account had not changed who I was. It had simply revealed a truth that had always existed beneath the surface of my family's story. Over the next several months Whitmore Logistics continued preparing for its public offering, but this time the leadership team worked closely with the legal advisors who understood the trust structure my grandfather created. The system had corrected the oversight exactly as it was designed to do. As for me, I continued working with data systems and logistics networks, but my life had expanded in ways I never expected. Part of the money transferred from the trust eventually funded a new foundation named after Arthur Whitmore. The foundation supported students who studied systems engineering and logistics management, especially those who felt overlooked or underestimated in traditional academic environments. Every time I reviewed the foundation reports I remembered something my grandfather once told me during one of our quiet Sunday afternoons. The people everyone overlooks are often the ones who notice how the system really works. For 18 years my family believed that the quiet daughter sitting at the edge of the room had nothing important to contribute. It turned out the system had been paying attention the entire time.